Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA, it's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. And we tackle issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments, and this program is part of that effort. Now, we're going to talk about war and peace in this episode. So, just a recap. In his book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? Professor Graham Allison informs the reader that when a colleague pressed German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg about what had caused World War I, which was up until then the most devastating war the world had seen, Hollweg replied, if we only knew. And Professor Allison then tells us that this response haunted John F. Kennedy, the US president, nearly 50 years later. And he was vacationing at Camp Cod in the summer of 1962, and he was reading Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August. And he essentially absorbed her argument that none of the European leaders understood the danger they faced. None wanted a war, and yet they sleepwalked into the abyss. So Kennedy pledged that if he ever found himself facing choices that could make the difference between catastrophic war and peace, he would be able to give history a better answer than Hollweg's. Now, as it happened, 2 months after he had read the book in October 1962, he was confronting the Cuban Missile Crisis. Did Kennedy do better than leaders that sleepwalked into the abyss? Well, Professor Ellison says that although he appreciated the dangers of his predicament, Kennedy repeatedly made choices he knew actually increased the risk of war, including nuclear war. Now we have an upcoming book, The Insider's Game, How Elites Make War and Peace, by Elizabeth Saunders, who is a professor of political science at Columbia University. Her research and teaching interests focus on international security and US foreign policy, including the presidency and foreign policy and the politics of using force. Before joining Columbia, she was a professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Her first book, Leaders at War, How Presidents Shape Military Interventions, was published in 2011 by Cornell University Press, and it won the 2012 Jervis-Schroeder Best Book Award. Professor Saunders is obviously well placed to analyze the factors that go into making life and death decisions. I have read the first chapter of the upcoming book, and it promises an appetizing menu. Now, given the ongoing wars, and I dare say many a looming one, I thought it would be great to get the professor to tell us how we should make sense of the violent world around us. Welcome to InFocus, Professor.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Likewise. So let me begin by flagging a few points from your latest work about, to quote you, why presidents, and we're talking about the US presidents, so often seem to make self-defeating choices. So your theory tells us to focus on the insider's game, because that is often the only game in town. That's what you actually say in the first chapter. To that end, you argue, and I quote, I argue, that means you arguing, that what I call the insider's game introduce a systematic set of distortions that lead to wars we would not expect under a public-driven model, as well as decisions about strategy and war fighting that are not part of most public-driven models at all. So let's begin here with why you think the elite or elites model is more important than the public-driven models, and what you mean by a systematic set of distortions, and then we can expand further.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to have the chance to talk about the book in the past tense, because it's done, and so I no longer have to think about revising it. This is a book that really, I've been working on this book for a long time, and it came out of discussions over lunch with colleagues, where I would listen to my colleagues who study American politics and American voting behavior. And the way they talked about how people vote was so different from the way I had learned about democratic accountability in my courses during my PhD in international politics. And we have this image that people go into the voting booth with kind of a scorecard, right? They think to themselves, how did the president do in the last war? Or what do I approve of what he did in this crisis and that crisis? And sort of we tot up the votes and then tot up the scores and then we vote, right? In reality, people vote for all kinds of reasons. And in local elections, they might vote for the person who's the top line on the ballot paper. And so scholars discovered that. And then we sometimes now have randomized order, like the ballots are put in random order. So people don't vote in a way that accords with the idea that they're going to always be holding leaders accountable for their foreign policy choices. And that to me was an important starting point. And I mean this not in a people should actually go and learn more about foreign policy and vote that way. We are all very busy people, all of us, no matter what our position, what country we are in. We all have, humans have a lot of things to deal with every day. And the way we manage that is through shortcuts. And we pay close attention to some things, and we pay almost no attention to other things. And we get information about that from people we trust or from the media, or we just ignore them. If you had me on your program to talk about healthcare policy, I would have nothing to say because I'm not an expert in that, right? And we can only handle, and we do this all day, every day in the world around us. So this is a very normal, this is not meant to be a scolding of voters. This is more realistic in terms of how we approach accountability in democracies. And we have this image that in at least in the United States, that we elect our leaders which include our senators and congresspeople, to go and faithfully enact policies that they think the people want. And that's the way we get around the problem of, voters can't pay attention to everything. So we hire essentially legislators and the president to worry about all these things. But the problem with that is it ignores the fact that these elites are people too, and they have their own incentives and they have their own views, and they may not accord with the voters' views on every policy. So it just struck me that instead of saying, why doesn't the public manage to constrain its leaders well enough so that they do what the public wants, we should start with the reality that the public probably does want peace more than war, but is willing to fight wars that it deems to be in the national interest. And what we really should do, but really more or less doesn't pay much attention, and that should be, we should take that seriously as a starting point, and then we should deal with the relationship between elites and presidents and elites and the voters. And we can't, leaving that aside in favor of democratic ideals where the voters are doing all the constraining directly themselves, just doesn't really get us very far. So that was kind of the genesis of this book. And as I began to work on it, there are all kinds of arguments that you hear, particularly in Washington, that there's a blob, this famous idea of the blob, a group of kind of basically all policymakers or policymaking adjacent people and think tanks and so forth that are warmongers essentially, and they have this interventionist mindset. They're always looking for a place to use military force. Military force is the solution to every problem, and I instinctively felt that could not be right as a blanket explanation, but nor are the flip side is not right either, right? That elites are all-knowing kind of experts that we should simply trust. And elites have made terrible mistakes in war and peace. In many other domains as well, but that's the one I know about is war and peace. So we shouldn't lionize them. We shouldn't put them on a pedestal. We treat them as political actors, which is what they are. And they have incentives and career incentives, political incentives in some cases. And unless we treat them as such, we will not be able to think about how to reform our politics or how to achieve better policymaking that does better accord with what the public wants.
Yeah, it's a very complex process. And as I said, I've read the first chapter of your upcoming book, and I'd certainly, try and get the book and see the case studies and, the modeling that you do with reference to various conflicts. But I agree with you generally, and you mentioned in your first chapter why you're focusing on the U.S. and not across the board. And you basically say that it restricts your domain, but it also gives you an advantage. So it's not a generalized theory, but it's something that works well within the U.S. context. So I agree with you. I mean, in many ways, voters everywhere have, call it division of labor, call it bounded rationality. You cannot really be an expert in everything, so you rely on others. I mean, we basically put our lives at stake going to doctors, and
Exactly.
we trust them.
Exactly.
So that's there. And I'm going to come to the complexity of the process, but because as I said in my opening with reference to your various positions, I was at Brookings in from October 2002 to May 2003. So I had a kind of ringside view of what was happening in the Saban Center, and how there was a push for the Iraq War, and I'm going to come to that. But going back to your theoretical framework, now, Morton Halperin wrote that book, which became very famous, and then he updated it also. And he spoke about shared images in his, this book, Bureaucratic Politics and Foreign Policy. And he argued that those images will decisively shape the stand they, which is the public and the government, take on particular issues. And he gave the examples of Cold War and 9/11. Now, does this make the cues you refer to, the cues that the elites being the cue givers, and which the public gets from the elite, easier for the elite to sell?
Well, I think there are certainly times when foreign policy is unavoidably front and center. 9/11 was one. The Cold War, it was sometimes front and center, but not always.
Correct.
I think we've seen, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Hamas attack on Israel were two moments where all of a sudden the TV screens were filled with foreign policy and war and peace. But it's remarkable how quickly attention drops off. If you do a search on Google Trends for Ukraine, you see a massive spike in the period, like the week leading up to the invasion. It drops off remarkably quickly. And I think we just have to always bear in mind that the context is important, but the post 9/11 environment, there was a brief period of unity, and if one lived through it, you might remember that the senators in the United States all stood on the steps of the Capitol and saying, "God bless America," I think, or the national anthem. I can't remember which, but it was this moment of coming together and the politics of it. I mean, you mentioned the period from October of 2002 through, the mid 2003 period. That was a very intense period of politicking and what we would now recognize as polarization and politicization of war and peace. So, yes, it made it easier to sell the war, but it didn't fundamentally alter the dynamic of the public and even many elites. I mean, it's important to note that, right? A lot of elites don't have their own access to information, or they only have access to part of the information, and they are information seekers or information takers, and the dynamics of that war have a lot in common with the dynamics of wars that happened before 9/11. And so it certainly might kind of lower the price, for to put it in very crude terms, for obtaining other elite support and for obtaining the voters' backing, but it doesn't fundamentally alter the dynamics. I would say these images or these moments of kind of reframing the narrative, to put it in the terms that Professor Ron Krebs has, narratives and the shaping of national security.
Right. You obviously will be in the subsequent chapters, you look into these various cases. There's also this issue of the media itself being briefed in a way which reflects the official position once a decision has been taken, and it kind of goes all the way. And in fact, to the extent where, for instance, if we talk about Afghanistan, the cigar reports year after year for almost 7 years were constantly saying this war is not going well, and these are the reasons. And so, but it took time for people in the media as well as in the public and among the analysts to actually begin to say, well, this actually isn't going well. Because when it began, the entire sort of ambiance, if you will, was completely different. And everyone, it was almost lemming like at one level. Although you did have dissenting voices, but there were not even, I mean,
Hardly any.
hardly any. I mean,
The
it was
one
just,
the one member of Congress, Barbara Lee, who voted against the authorization to use force in Afghanistan, was she received death threats.
yeah. So there you are. But going back to your book, as I mentioned, Morton Halperin. Now, in his book, he talks about the process and says that it involves the bureaucracy and the president as he deals with the bureaucracy. And then he defines the bureaucracy as civilian career officials and political appointees, as well as military officers. You also mentioned three groups, but you seem to be expanding the numbers when you refer to the elites. And of course, you're focusing more directly on the issues of war and peace, not in a more broader sense, foreign policy per se. Have I got that right?
Yes, I mean, I think I considered for a long time, where to draw the line when you're making theoretical, when you're building a theoretical model, you always have to think about the tension between, descriptive accuracy. You can add more variables and it will explain more, but then it will include so much that it doesn't really explain anything.
Yeah.
And so I would give talks and I would engage and get feedback, and people would say, well, what about this group? What about this group? And I finally settled on three that I thought there are a lot of different kinds of elites that are involved in every decision about war and peace. But there are only three, I think, well, maybe four, but I'll talk about why I didn't include it, that are involved in every decision, right? So this decision or that decision might involve, a lobbying group on behalf of another country, but it won't be involved in the next decision, right? The three that are always involved are members of Congress, the bureaucracy, top level bureaucrats and advisors, and military leaders. Those three, pretty much you can count on their participation in some form, or perhaps exclusion, depending on what the president does, in just about every decision about war and peace. The fourth group,
sorry, just a clarification.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the president, you're talking about the administration, as in the president and his cabinet members?
Yes, but also I would include in that officials who are kind of below the top level of the cabinet, right? Or the intelligence community. So, members of the executive, high-level members of the executive branch.
Okay.
I did not include the media because, although I think they are always, well, they're not always, because they don't always get the information. But I think they're a strategic player in a very different way. And I decided I would not theorize that directly and sort of leave that to one side. And I explain some of that in the book. But I think it's important to treat all three of, one thing you immediately notice when you think about those is two of those groups are not elected. And we have this epithet in Washington, unelected bureaucrats. Like, why are we allowing unelected bureaucrats to make these choices? And some, cabinet members and many of their most senior deputies, military officials, will be subject to Senate confirmation, which is a kind of vetting and a check by those who are elected. Although that has been increasingly politicized as well. But their names are never on a ballot. And Congress has, over time, increasingly abrogated most of its war-making authority. It does less and less and less. Yes. We can come to that if you like. But so how do we? I firmly believe it's important to think of all of these elites as political in the broadest sense, not just partisan political, but political actors, right? People who want to engage in the political process, the political bargaining, where we agree to do something we might not otherwise want to do in exchange for receiving something that we do care about. That could be a policy preference about maybe how to fight the war or the larger number of troops. It could be the support of the president or the president not attacking you if you're a member of Congress running for re-election, which of course was a huge issue in October 2002 when there was the debate over the authorization for the use of force in Iraq, and the Bush administration put tremendous pressure on members of Congress. But I think we can also think about the unelected elites as having long careers, and they want to be successful, and they might want to work for future administrations, and they might believe sincerely that they need to voice their opinion, but that get on board once the decision is made by the elected president. And they want to retain their influence over policy after the war starts or after the decision not to go to war unfolds. And I think that we'd be missing a lot if we didn't take that seriously and theorize those actors also as political actors. And then when you get into sort of what scholars have found about queuing, where if you are someone who is well known for your hawkish, think of a John Bolton, right? Someone who is known for very, very hawkish views. What he says about war and peace, it might not be that informative if he's for war, but if he's not for war, that gets people's attention, right? And so you do have all of these interesting dynamics where what these advisors say can have a real effect on political debate. And it's not always directly to the voters. Sometimes it's that, in a closed door briefing, if he said in a closed door briefing with members of Congress, I don't think this war is a good idea. Most voters don't know who he is, but the members of Congress know who he is, and that might sway them, and then they go out and speak to their constituents, right? So that is a political dynamic, and we need to treat that as such if we are going to understand why Afghanistan, I think, fell off the media's radar, in part because the narrative, as you rightly pointed out, was that everything was done. It was essentially over in December of 2001. And then Iraq began to dominate the headlines. But even then, it was sort of a tacit consensus. But one of the things I point out in my book is that elite consensus is no accident, right? When you have unity, whether it's sort of silence or when you have the kind of unity that you saw, unity I put in air quotes, in the Iraq War, where it seemed as though everybody in Washington was in favor, that was purchased at a political price. And at the time, it seemed like a pretty low price to George W. Bush. But elite consensus is often the product of a lot of political bargaining that goes on behind the scenes. And it's quite consequential. And it can quickly unravel when things begin to go wrong. And so I don't think we can simply look at the fact that people were sort of tacitly assuming Afghanistan was all fine and think we can't just conclude that they were ignorant of it. We know they weren't ignorant of it. We have so many examples, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, where everybody knew it was not going well. And yet the facade of unity remained. And what I'm trying to point out is that is quite political.
Right. So I'm going to come to that. But a quick follow-up question with reference to the three groups. You talked about the media. Now, obviously, in the past 6 or 7 or 10 years, increasingly, when we talk about media, we're not just talking about the mainstream media. We now have social media with TikToks and Facebook and Twitter and the rest of it,
and partisan media too,
and YouTube and the rest. Now, as a matter of fact, what we have witnessed increasingly is that while the mainstream media uh, pushes out very often, not always, but very often, the talking points from the Pentagon briefing or the State Department briefing and the rest of it, you got people out there who are saying, no, this is not right. And they have a lot of influence, increasingly a lot of influence. So would you, if you were to, and I don't want to ask you this because you've just finished this book and certainly would be a great effort to go and revise it, but in the event that if and when you were to update it, do you think that this would constitute a factor, the social media?
This is a terrific question. I mean, I do tackle the question of how time bound it is in the context of polarization, extreme polarization today. I mean, one of the reasons the book took so long was that I was just about to start a year of sabbatical to finish writing it when the 2016 election happened. And it was such a surprising outcome. And the election had really been about, in part, I mean, it was about many things, but it was this populist leader with an anti-elite message who was deliberately saying, I'm not going to have the usual advisors. I'm not going to hire the establishment, against someone who was the emblematic of the establishment, Hillary Clinton. Yeah. So it seemed odd it took me a while to think about, well, what does this mean for a book about the dominance of elites if they're being attacked? And of course, this was all happening it wasn't just in the US. There was Brexit, which is very much an anti-expert sort of campaign, and so forth. So, but after a while, I concluded, well, it's still the case that the public doesn't pay that much attention to foreign policy. And I think things have changed, even if you just consider polarization and the fragmentation of the media. We also in the United States now have partisan media, right? There's social media, which is what you've been discussing. And then
you already always had partisan media in the United States.
Yes, but the rise of Fox News and it, I think is really a newer phenomenon. That's sort of what I'm getting at. So I think social media is another layer on top of this. And I think what it's done is undermine the sort of authority of a lot of these elites. But I also think we will not be, that might be the next book, but we would not be able to understand understand that dynamic without understanding what came before. And so I ended up coming back to the book as it was and didn't change it very much in response to 2016, because I think it's so important to understand what was better about the previous era and what was wrong with it, right? I mean, I try to be very clear-eyed. This is not a call for going back to some wonderful bipartisan consensus of yore. There never was one. It was highly, highly political. But it had its problems, and the elite bargaining led to some terrible tragedies, Vietnam War being, top of the list in terms of US military interventions. So I try to be very realistic about all of this, but I also think we have to appreciate what social media's effect on elite messaging has been, and it has benefits and it has costs, and there are real costs, and we can't understand those costs if we don't know what the benefits used to be.
Right. Okay. So I just want to problematize it a little bit, with your permission.
Yes, of course. That's the business we're in.
Right. So I want to circle back at this point to the public and public attitudes to a decision to go to war, or the scope of that war, and I say scope of that war because the US participation in any conflict can and has ranged from full-scale invasion to a bombing campaign to special forces ops to a supporting role, as in the case of Ukraine or the atrocities going on in Gaza. And we've seen the public in the US and in Europe resist wars ex ante.
Yes.
And so Iraq, Syria, Libya, now Gaza. Now, your model generally assumes and we've discussed it, but I just want to kind of put the focus back on this. Little interest among the public in knowing the nuances, and that's right, they can't, not everyone, and they do rely on elite cues. How does it square with examples where there was clear, and if I might add, clear-eyed opposition to some wars? And so before you address this, I also want you to address an allied question. What do even developed democracies lack when administrations can rush into conflicts and forever wars despite clear ex ante opposition? And you actually wonder, to quote you, and I'm quoting you, how so many leaders started, escalated, and perpetuated war efforts that observers argued at the time were risky at best and doomed at worst, and which the public turned against long before its leaders ended the conflict. So the reason I quoted from you is that you're quite aware of this issue.
Well, I think it gets back to the puzzle of where did the public constraint go? Why did it not? I mean, one of the difficult things about studying public opinion on any issue, but especially on an issue like War and Peace that is so consequential and yet so elusive in terms of finding its political impact, is understanding how you go from the public having a preference to some political outcome. And we have many examples where the preference got lost along the way, right? And Richard Nixon ran on a secret plan to end the Vietnam War, and there were 50,000 dead, after he was elected, and he escalated the war in dramatic and tragic ways in Cambodia and so forth, right? So presidents clearly don't feel always bound by public opinion directly. I mean, I think the protests in Europe on the eve of the Iraq War are a very good example of this. And some of the leaders did heed those warnings, but they also had their own reasons for not, historically, for example, France had been running flights to Iraq in the 1990s, and against the US wishes, right? So there were other reasons why those leaders didn't support the war. Tony Blair had those protests and basically ignored them, right? And so
not only did he ignore them, he was actually lots of his own party members, the Labour members, voted against, while the Tories actually supported him.
Yes, exactly. And I think this is why you have to get into the question of political parties and what they want to do. We tend as security scholars quite naturally to isolate these decisions from all the other decisions that presidents or Democratic leaders have to make. But they have to worry about everything. We just had the State of the Union speech here in Washington last night, and there was some foreign policy in it, and there were a lot of other things in it, right? I mean, the president does not have the luxury of saying, I can't keep track of every issue. He needs to be cued on every single issue every day, pretty much. And so I think it's crucial to understand that the public may have a preference, but presidents have a lot of other moving parts that they have to think about. And you see over and over this dynamic where the party on the right is more hawkish in general and therefore more naturally supportive of war. And what really matters is what the left or dovish party does. It mattered in Iraq because you had a Republican president and who had the support of his Republican colleagues pretty much automatically. And the question was, what would the Democrats do? And they were under tremendous pressure to support him.
But may I?
Yes,
so,
of course.
Yeah. So on the issue of Ukraine, for instance,
yes,
President Biden is far more hawkish compared to the GOP. Now, there's some in the GOP, like Nikki Haley and others, who would, if they were to come to the White House, pursue that policy. But others say you're taking the eye off the ball, because your peer competition is with China, and Russia is not really a major concern that way. Similarly, President Biden, despite opposition from his essential support base, is carrying on with this policy of supporting Israel and Gaza. And since you talked about the State of the Union address, among various other headaches that he has, you have people like, I'm sure you must have watched that YouTube video by Senator Katie Britt, and what she said about how the president was essentially, she was saying that he's completely useless and he needs to leave. So it's a strange kind of mix in terms of heading a supposedly dovish party, but being more hawkish on certain issues, and getting roasted by the Republicans and losing his own support base. How does it look like for him going
Well,
forward?
this is really where, I mean, if I had to pick one thing that has changed dramatically since 2016 in terms of foreign policy, it is the Republican stance on Russia. And I think that is the real the situation that Biden is in right now. It's hard to imagine any other Republican president who winning in 2016, because if you remember, there were so many candidates in 2016, which was one of the reasons why, the failure to coordinate against Trump is one reason why he ended up winning the nomination. So but I think this is really where things have changed. So what do I mean? Why do I say that? If you look at the polling on views of Vladimir Putin and Russia in the United States over time, you see a very consistent trend where Putin's approval ratings in the United States are extremely low with both parties. And there's a bit of a gap, and Republicans are more negative on Putin, but everybody's negative. I mean, it's not as though the Democrats are pro-Putin, right? And the trend is sort of like moving along. And then when Trump gets the nomination in or August of 2016, all of a sudden the Republican ratings go almost to neutral on Putin.
Yeah.
And the Democratic ones go even lower. It is quite dramatic. And I think it is truly one of those instances where there has always been an isolationist wing in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. But Trump was the first candidate. Pat Buchanan was another candidate in this vein, more isolationist. I mean, it's a long tradition of candidates in this vein, but none of them ever won the presidency. And when Trump got that prize, the prize is you get to reshape the national, your party's position on a lot of things. And this has been the most dramatic. And the Republicans in the Senate in particular tried hard to resist him in the first term. But now the House of Representatives has enough people who are Trump followers that they are now holding Ukraine policy hostage, even though the rest of the party probably would prefer to vote for Ukraine aid. And so you have this very strange dynamic where Democrats have become the more hawkish party in a way, because the Republican internationalists are shrinking, in number every day. So in that sense, I do think Biden faces a changed world. And it doesn't seem as though it's going to go back anytime soon, given Trump's grip on the party. I think if Nikki Haley were the nominee, she would make an attempt to sort of move it back towards a strong confrontation from Russia. But the idea that they would go to the Ronald Reagan Library and have a debate, and it would be a major question of whether to take a strong stance on Russia. I mean, this is the party of Reagan, the Republican Party debating whether to take a strong stance against Russia, to have that be an open question and talk about it at the Reagan Library. To me, that was a really stunning moment. And in that sense, I do think that is we political scientists love to say that's not new. It's not new. This is new. I think.
Okay, so before I go to the final question with reference to your book, I want to ask you something else also, and it's not part of this book, but since you've written a previous book leaders at war, how presidents shape military interventions. I want to ask you if the hawkishness within the doves, the Democrat doves, comes from this whole idea of neoliberal values, what Professor Mearsheimer termed delusional, um, and to sort of expand the American values to the rest of the world and free trade. And although there is no more free trade, um, it never was, but to the extent that there were these ideas of neoliberal trade, that's basically sanctions, and it's more geoeconomics now in the Lutvakian or the Robert Blackwell's sense. So do you think that the neoliberal ideas or values also impact the sort of hawkishness within the dovish camp?
I'm no economic expert, but I don't think so. I think there are some genuinely hawkish liberals. The hawkish internationalism spans both parties, and I think there have always been more interventionist inclined Democrats that sincerely believe that. And I also think there are Democrats who've gone along with wars because they get something in return for it. And they might not want to acknowledge it, but this is what I call the dove's curse. That it is that and this gets back to the question of like, what is it about elites, as you said, that's different from the voters, and what do you make of protests that don't seem to translate into policy constraint? And it's because presidents have other things they want to do. Lyndon Johnson wanted to pass the Great Society and the Voting Rights Act. And he believed, and he may have been wrong, but there's a lot of evidence that this is what he believed, that if he did not escalate or did not take enough of a stand in the Vietnam War, he would not be able to get the votes that he needed for the Great Society, that it would be used as a cudgel against him. And so he didn't so much want to spread
That's what you call the bargaining. I mean,
yes,
essentially doing something externally to get something on the domestic side.
Yes, and it's not always an explicit acknowledged trade, right? What he's trying to do in this case is to stave off, to neutralize the issue so that it doesn't become something that there are famous quotes that he used with colorful language that I won't repeat here. That they would use it against him.
This being a family channel.
Yes, the family channel. If you never can quote Lyndon Johnson on a family channel. But he has some very colorful quotes where he said, if I pulled out of Vietnam, they would use it against me in much more inappropriate language. And so it's not as though, politicians don't like to talk about this in really political terms. It sounds unseemly to make these bargains about national security, but that doesn't mean the bargains aren't happening, right? I mean, it denies the opposition. At that time, the votes he was really more worried about were votes from within his own party, because the Southern Democrats, who were also segregationists, were the ones he feared would hold it against him and filibuster his civil rights bills. He only felt he could ask for one difficult set of votes, not two, right? Or make a difficult choice on one issue and not two issues. And if he believed that if he didn't stand firm in Vietnam, that would give them an issue to use to just whack him over the head with it, and it would torpedo his domestic program. So I think that is one reason why you end up with this political bargaining that doesn't always seem like political bargaining, and why there are doves who support wars as a way of getting other priorities they care, and they delude themselves into believing it'll be a splendid little war or a quick war or worth the cost. So I think we can't ignore the politics of this. If we diagnose it as ideology or the blob, the fixes that we might try to implement to break that cycle. I mean, a lot of times you hear, well, we only had more dovish voices. There were a lot of dovish voices.
So going back to James Farron's paper about realist assumptions of war, and so how do you figure out what is a Pareto efficient war and what is not? But I think it's a good point to segue to my final question with reference to what your theory mentions about the cost all around being higher for doves. And you talk about the you make 3 points with reference to selection pressures, agenda costs, and the costs of obtaining counter-type elite support. So if you could quickly explain this, and then we'll close this.
Sure. Well, I think, one question is why can't doves be themselves? My argument is hawks have an easier time being themselves, being hawks, than doves can be doves. So why is that? One reason is because, a major reason is because for better or for worse, and often for worse, hawks are more trusted on national security issues. That's what they're known for. And they tend to have fewer other domestic priorities. So when you get a dovish president, even one who sincerely believes that war is not a good policy in certain instances, you often will have already had hawkish advisors embedded in the policy process, whether they're in the military. They don't need to be.
That's what you call selection process.
Yeah, but you have to have somebody running policy and preparing for eventualities, right? Often you have more explicit choices to bring. There's a long tradition of Republican secretaries of defense in Democratic administrations.
Yes.
But it never goes the other way around.
Yeah.
So you're more likely to have sort of hawkish voices with a front row seat. So that's the selection mechanism. And then when the war decision comes, those voices are in the mix. And if they are displeased, you have to pay that political price. Yeah. The second reason is they have higher agenda costs. So that gets into the what else do they want to do? Do they want to pay the political costs of standing firm on their dovish policy and let that be a cudgel that can be used against them and potentially lose their domestic success? Doves have a bigger risk of that because they tend to want to do more. Democrats traditionally have more ambitious domestic agenda in terms of legislation and complicated social policy. So that's another reason. And the third is if they want to get a hawk to endorse their decision not to use force, that's a much bigger ask. Getting John Bolton to say war is a bad idea. To convince him to do that, you have to, right? Because that's his issue. Whereas a hawk can more cheaply get the dove, the countertype, to say this is a war worth fighting. That's what happened in the Iraq War. It was relatively speaking less expensive. Now, this is where I think there's a very interesting dynamic now with Biden and Democrats in general. One of the few upsides that you can think of with polarization is maybe it makes it easier for Democrats to just be doves if that's what they want to be. Think of Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Kabul. Disastrous in its execution and politically speaking. You can see that there was he paid a price for that. On the other hand, a few months later, he passed this major domestic legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was also essentially a major climate bill, but was given this Inflation Reduction Act title. If he's going to be able to absorb those costs, and it still just comes down to that, the legislation passed 51-49, right? Which is what might have happened even if he had stayed in Afghanistan, or if the withdrawal had gone smoothly. So if everything is polarized and it's all along party lines and there's no bargaining that's really possible, it decouples this it reduces at least the agenda cost dimension of it, and it makes it easier for a dove to just be a dove, if that's what they really believe is in the national interest. So it doesn't take away the asymmetry.
Then he went and he threw everything and the kitchen sink into the Ukraine war, and he's done the same with Gaza. So
and there hasn't been much political upside from it, right? So if everyone is just going to stick to their party team, it reduces the political pressure on Democratic presidents to be hawkish for the sake of being hawkish, right? That's the part that I think is.
I think in a way, Biden, when he was the VP and even before that as a senator, was always hawkish on Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So with Putin coming into Ukraine, that kind of opened up space for him. And of course, the fact that, the Europeans were all, at least at that time, all together. Now, of course, we see that there are obviously these differences. You've got Hungary, you've got Serbia, you've got many others which at least they want to go their own way. But at least initially, there was a consensus that something needs to be done to stop Putin.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that also kind of, in a way, gives one a sense of where a president, even a supposedly dovish president, is going to go. And even in the case of Israel, now we obviously know from his entire dossier on Israel for the last 50 years, starting with him being a senator, was essentially that there cannot be, as he put it himself, there cannot be any daylight between the United States and Israel. So I think once again, with this, when the violence started, it gave him the opportunity to sort of throw everything into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Biden is certainly in the tradition of hawkish internationalists. He voted for the Iraq War. He did try to force a resolution through Congress that would have put some more constraint on Bush. But, I mean, I would put him in the camp that is more naturally inclined to use military force in some cases. He clearly opposed nation building in Afghanistan as VP.
Yes.
And, the political consensus, people forget that there was actually consensus after 20 years of war that it was time for the U.S. commitment to end.
Trump started.
Yes, exactly. Trump was very, he negotiated the deal with the Taliban, or his proxy did. But so I think he was prepared to pay whatever costs he expected ex ante. The real question was, I think there's a world in which a Democratic president might feel the need, once things began to go so surprisingly badly so quickly, the fall of Kabul and the scenes at the airport, might have said, okay, we'll stay at Bagram Air Base with 2,000 troops for another 6 months. And surely that would not have solved anything really, but it would have been a politically appealing choice for
in terms of optics.
Yes, in terms of optics.
Yeah.
But he came out and made this defiant speech that said, I will not pass. I'm the 5th president, I think, and I won't pass it on to the next person. And he was clearly prepared to absorb those costs, which may have been higher than he expected initially.
Yeah.
And so I think these caricatures of hawks and doves are so unfortunate, because all presidents think some wars are worth fighting and others are not. And Ronald Reagan was extremely hawkish, but one of the chapters in my book is when he is constrained and pulls troops out of Lebanon, right? So, we shouldn't, a hawk does not mean every conflict, right? Or fighting every conflict in a certain way. Biden was in favor of a counterterrorism approach in Afghanistan in 2009, but not nation building. And that's those distinctions are extremely important for understanding the war, right? So I think it's unfortunate, but I do think we need to distinguish between people with genuinely more hawkish beliefs and those who go along, because they end up on the same side of the war decision, but they get there by such different political processes. And
which is why I eagerly await your book, because I mean, given this discussion and of course the complexity of the entire thing,
and the
it's,
ballot we have in the fall.
yeah, it was a major undertaking on your part to try and sort of get a theoretical model on this. But I'm really grateful to you, Professor Saunders, for being on the program. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you for
And
having me. It's really fun to discuss it.
this is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.